wrong and they weren't going to use it again because he had used it in his lecture. It's used 3 times in the UN's 2007 report. He didn't get back to me. He was too arrogant. So I reported him to the Charity Commission in the United Kingdom for false accounting, which is a serious imprisonable criminal offence. And the Charity Commission are now investigating because for 3 years, a charity of which he is a trustee, and so is the previous chairman of the IPCC in London, has filed accounts showing income of less than £10,000 when I can prove that they had income in the hundreds of thousands and may even have had income in the millions. So we are dealing with outright fraud. I gave him the chance to show that he had good faith and that he would put right an obvious scientific wrong. He didn't do it. He now faces prison. So now let's clear away all the various bogus lines, except the single 150-year trend line at 0.4 Celsius per century of warming. And let's add that little magenta line from 1975 to 2001, where you see quite a steep rate of warming. But you also see it from 1910 to 1940, precisely the same slope of that arrow, and that means precisely the same warming rate, actually about 0.16 Celsius per century. And indeed, we can do it again from 1860 to 1880. Exactly the same trends. So what evidence have they got that the trend at the right-hand end of that graph, 1975 to 2001, is with more than 50% certainty caused by humankind when the other two can't possibly have been? So you can just see, these are obvious points I'm making. There's nothing complicated about any of this. It's really straightforward. And here is why this has all gone so wrong. This is the raw and adjusted temperatures at Darwin Airport. And this is showing you exactly what's going on here. The raw temperatures show a fall. That's the blue line there. The adjusted temperatures show an enormous increase. And the difference is nearly 2 Celsius degrees. Because somebody has been systematically tampering with the temperature data here and at thousands of other terrestrial temperature stations around the world, so that before the satellites came along to stop them doing this, we simply don't know whether there was any warming at all in the early part of the 20th century. We simply don't know. Darwin, here again, you can see how extreme some of the corrections were on that graph. So what we've got to do then is to try and find out what causes these sudden spurts in warming. We've seen 3 of them. The first 2, we can't find out anything about them because they were too long ago and we didn't have the instruments to measure things properly in those days. Nor can we rely on the temperature record at all. However, in the satellite era, on the right there, the right-hand side of the green vertical line, which is around 1983, from that moment on, we had satellites available. And we're going to look at one particular phenomenon, which is the correlation between the amount of sunlight actually hitting the ground, getting through the clouds and hitting the ground, and the temperature of the Earth. Here is a record of the solar irradiance in red versus temperature in blue. This is taken by calorimeters in Japan, and they've had them all over Japan for the last 100 years. It's one of the oldest and most reliable temperature records we've got. It's actually a radiance record rather than a temperature record, but the temperature record is shown with it. There is a very clear and very close correlation between the two, and a good reason to suppose that in this instance, indeed, we might have correlation implying causation. It doesn't necessarily do so, but it's at least a working hypothesis that if you get more sunshine hitting you, you're going to get hotter. So, what I then did was I wanted to try and find out whether there was, in fact, a change in the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth between 1983 and 2001, the period of the satellite record during which there was a continuous upward movement in temperature. And I found a paper by Pinker et al., here is the graph from it, which shows there was a cloud radiative forcing, extra radiation hitting the ground, because there were fewer clouds there over that period, amounting to 3 watts per square metre over the entire period. Now, when you think that the entire human effect on the climate since 1750 is only 1.6 watts per square metre, and you have this enormous change in the amount of radiation hitting the ground just because we had fewer clouds over those 19 years, that's really what's going on. These huge fluctuations up and down in temperature seem to me to be caused by changes in cloud cover. If they are, then the climate sensitivity, which we can do a simple calculation, I'm not going to take you through it in detail, is going to be a tiny, tiny fraction of what the UN thinks it is. The UN thinks we will get 3.26 Celsius as the average sort of warming to be expected if you double the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, as we may by the end of this century. Whereas if you correct it for the effect of those clouds, you're looking at less than half a degree Celsius, which means the UN is exaggerating the effect of CO2 on temperature 7.5 times over. Take that exaggeration away, and you take away the problem. No more climate problem, because it's entirely based on that central exaggeration. Well, how do we check it? We're going to do this very, very quickly, because then I'll take some questions. First of all, I think we need surface and ship-mounted calorimeters and thermometers all over the world in the same sites, and all of them free of the urban heat island effect. We need them automatically reporting by satellite in the same way as the Argo bathythermographs do it. And we need to have visual and automated diagnostics to make sure they're working properly and they haven't been tampered with. That way, within 10 years, we will have a reliable answer to whether this hypothesis is right. I'm pretty sure it is right. We'll have a detailed estimate of climate sensitivity by then. This is the simplest, clearest, and most compelling way to do it. We can also look at some of the things that are already measured and appearing in the literature. First of all, the UN bases its entire case on models, but the models are in fact useless, and I'm going to show you quickly why. Here are some things you can prove. You can prove Pythagoras' theorem. There is Aryabhata's proof. It's a very elegant proof without words. I won't even need to explain it to you. It's self-evident. And that was invented in the 5th century by a wonderful Hindu mathematician. Here is my version, which is slightly more complicated to look at. It's based on his proof, but it's elegant because there's only one little frame with all the pieces in it. That, too, is a complete proof without words. However, with the climate is a chaotic object. That has a particular meaning in mathematics, which I'm going to look at very quickly. Here is an extremely simple chaotic equation, but I'm going to specify the real and imaginary parts of the complex number c to 16 places of decimals, and then I'm going to draw a map. Now, you might think, really simple equation, and you might get a really simple drawing like this. Now, you're going to love this slide. This is really pretty, and it's really fascinating. This is what actually happens if you have a chaotic equation. It's extremely complicated. And there's no way you could have foreseen those complications unless you knew to that very exact 16 places precision. If I had changed the last 4 places, then that picture wouldn't have appeared. If I'd added 1 to both sides, the entire picture would have disappeared. That's how sensitive a chaotic equation is, and therefore a chaotic climate is, to the very slightest change in the initial conditions before you start trying to project it out into the future. That's why the Wet Office in the UK, for 9 years out of 10, has predicted summers that were warmer than they actually turned out to be. Partly because it's biased in favour of the global warming theory, and partly because you can't actually tell, more than a few weeks out, how far the climate is going to develop or in which direction. And that is why this very distinguished scientist here, Shunichi Akasofu, says it's difficult to prove definitively a simplistic hypothesis that says the greenhouse effect is responsible for the warming we've seen. Indeed, he says that because the climate sensitivity, the one thing we want to know from these models, is told to them in advance, the computers are completely useless for telling us what we really want to know about the climate. That's why any case based on models isn't going to work. Next point. Here is the sun. And we've talked about the sun and the clouds briefly, but also the sun itself has been increasing its activity over the last 300 years. It's gone from a 11,400-year minimum only 300 years ago to an 11,400-year maximum in the last 70 years of the 20th century. You don't see that reported anywhere, but that is also likely to have been the underlying reason why there's been warming over the last 300 years. And here is a correlation between solar radiance at the surface again and mean surface temperature, done by my distinguished colleague Willie Soon at the Harvard-Smithsonian Institute for Astrophysics. When then they say it's CO2, well, it isn't, because look how little the CO2 in the atmosphere is. There was 0.03% of the atmosphere, CO2. Now it's 0.04. It's gone up by 0.01% by volume. That is simply not enough to wreak any major changes. And the CO2 is itself not increasing in the atmosphere as fast as it should. It's following